So hello and welcome back to Books and Things. Welcome to the third day of What the Dickens. Today I'm going to be talking about Charles Dickens's The Pickwick Papers. Chapter 1. The Pickwickians. The first ray of light which illuminates the gloom and converts into a dazzling brilliancy that obscurity in which the earlier history of the public career of the immortal Pickwick would appear to be involved, is derived from the perusal of the following entry of the transactions of the Pickwick Club, which the editor of these papers feels the highest pleasure in laying before his readers. So The Pickwick Papers is Charles Dickens's first novel, and I do think you can really tell that it's his first novel. I am very fond of The Pickwick Papers. It is possibly Dickens's funniest book, partly because it is Dickens' least serious book, and partly because it is just simply very funny, but it doesn't have the same sort of plot structure or even plot as many of his other books do. It follows the adventures of Mr. Pickwick and the Pickwick Club, which basically consists of Mr. Pickwick and his three best friends going around doing slightly crazy things. It's a very episodical novel. You can understand that it would work very well in serial form, but it doesn't have much of a consistent plot that runs through the whole book. It's more of Mr. Pickwick and his friends doing some nice things, then that kind of closes, and then another chapter involving Pickwick and his friends doing some more things, and then they do some more things. It doesn't really have an overarching plot in the same way that all the rest of his novels do. For that reason, I wouldn't suggest it as a good starting place with Dickens, but I do think it's really fun and I do really enjoy it. It is very, very funny, as I said, and Mr. Pickwick is a lovely character. He is really well-meaning and a bit buffoonish in that he never quite realises what he's doing. He gets himself involved in silly situations. He is very oblivious to the world around him. He is very well-meaning and so is often very deceived. He reminds me of Winnie the Pooh. That's who Mr. Pickwick reminds me of. Not just because he is of a infamously rotund character, but he just reminds me of Winnie the Pooh. It's funny and all the more like really sad as well as funny because he means so well that he just ends up in the most silly situation. Mr. Pickwick climbs over the wall of a girls' school to warn this young woman about a scoundrel who is about to try to make off with her, who she really shouldn't trust, and of course everyone in the school thinks that he is a scoundrel because he's broken into this school, and it's really funny. It's very well done. He gets himself into a lot of very silly situations as do his friends, but at the same time as there being all that silliness, there are some really touching moments. And Mr. Pickwick, as a kind of Winnie the Pooh figure, is very, very lovable. I also enjoy his friends. They are also quite entertaining characters, and the whole book is just very, very funny. My favourite character in the Pickwick Papers by a long way is Sam Weller, who is Mr. Pickwick's manservant. Sam Weller is so funny and so kind of eccentric but beautiful at the same time, and he is a lovely, wonderful character. He is so devoted to Mr. Pickwick in a really nice way. They have a really interesting friendship that is, I think, done very, very well in the Pickwick Papers. I also really enjoy Sam Weller's relationship with a servant called Mary, which is very, very sweetly, kind of coyly written by Dickens. It's not a massive part of the book, but it's very cute and nicely done. In fact, it's a much more realistic and believable romantic relationship than, for example, Nicholas and Madeline in Nicholas Nickleby, which I mentioned yesterday. Even if Sam and Mary's relationship isn't as central to the book as Nicholas's and Madeline's is, I think it's more believable and it just feels a bit more real. I do quite enjoy the silliness of the Pickwick Papers because it is such a silly book in many ways. It would never be my favourite Dickens novel, but it is really fun and entertaining to read. There are things I like less about the Pickwick Papers. In general, unlike Oliver Twist and Nicholas Nickleby, the things I like less about the Pickwick Papers tend to be like absences of things rather than presences of things, if that makes sense. Like Nicholas Nickleby and like Oliver Twist, like many of Dickens's early novels, the presentation of women in the Pickwick Papers is very limited. It is a very, very male book. It is about men, and it is about male friendship, which I do like. It's really interesting to read a book about 19th century male friendship, and it's a very interesting book in terms of ideas about masculinity, but the women just faint and cry and scream and go hysterical. They do that as well in the Pickwick Papers. In fact, there is a quote from the Pickwick Papers which I used in my dissertation title, which is, "The males turned pale and the females fainted." And a lot of the Pickwick Papers is like that. It's very fun and it's very silly. Everyone is a caricature, and the women especially are a particular kind of caricature. And while there is a really wide variation in the different kind of male caricatures that Dickens draws, there's a much smaller variation in the female caricatures that Dickens draws, and that is a shame in the Pickwick Papers. It does kind of irritate me. I wouldn't say that the poor presentation of women is as marked in the Pickwick Papers as it is in Oliver Twist or Nicholas Nickleby, partly because the novel is, as I say, a bit more of a male novel, and because it doesn't have the same kind of overarching plot as Oliver Twist or Nicholas Nickleby, but it does still kind of irk me while reading it. Another reason why I think the Pickwick Papers would never be like up there in my favourite Dickens is just because it doesn't have that kind of overarching interweaving plot in the same way that some of Dickens's later works do, and it feels more of a kind of periodic entertainment rather than a novel. Another thing to note about the Pickwick Papers is it has quite a few like short stories within it where various characters tell other characters' stories, which is very fun, but it kind of makes the novel feel a little bit messy and a little bit less like a novel. The Pickwick Papers is really good fun and very entertaining, but it isn't as polished and refined as some of Dickens's later works in my opinion. I do really enjoy it, but yes, not my favourite. I don't have a particular TV or film adaptation of the Pickwick Papers to recommend. There hasn't been an adaptation of it to my knowledge for the last sort of 25-30 years. I think there was one in the 80s, but I haven't seen it. I would like to, but I haven't got around to it yet. I don't know why there hasn't been an adaptation of it. I think because of the episodic nature of the Pickwick Papers, it would make for a very, very entertaining TV series, but somehow no one has done that yet, which saddens me. I want more BBC Dickens adaptations. They haven't done one since Little Dorrit, and it really makes me so sad, except for Great Expectations. They do Great Expectations, but we don't talk about that because that was awful and that irritated me. More on that later. For now, suffice to say, I do very much enjoy the Pickwick Papers. I find it very, very entertaining, and I think it's one of Dickens's funniest novels, but I don't think it's one of his best. Generally, as I said before, I prefer Dickens's later works, partly because of the way that his presentation of women and just his kind of characterisation and the complexity of it changes over time through the course of his works, but also partly because his later novels are a bit darker. Pickwick Papers, however, is light and silly and very funny and truly beautiful. It warms my heart whenever I read it because it is so wonderfully funny. So that is all I wanted to say about the Pickwick Papers. I'll be back tomorrow where I'll be talking about another Dickens book. Indefatigable. What?